Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Malik Coleman. I work for New York City Transit, but just the transit fan in general. And then because this is virtually in Philly, and Philly has one of the best networks, at least, of regional rail in the country, I figured we should have a panel on regional rail. So let me just post the link again to some people that are just coming in. I know we got the rail transit in the U.S., but just for regional rail, I want to just get it worldwide, just so we can just get best practices from around the world, not just the U.S., and then looking at some of these ridership numbers. So if you click that wiki link, and then you can sort the list, hit the daily ridership column. If you sort it by ridership, you should see JR East Tokyo, number 1, 16 million daily riders. And then I just downloaded the U.S. ridership numbers. And so all the systems in the U.S., the daily ridership is about 1.7 million. And just a little more than half of that, 930,000, is New York City. So Long Island Railroad, New Jersey Transit, and Metro North. And then 800,000 is outside New York City. And then out of that 800,000, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia combined are about 550,000 daily riders. So we got New York City, 933,000, Chicago, Boston, and Philly combined, 550,000, and everywhere else outside of that, 270,000. But, I mean, if you look at those numbers, I mean, JR East is crazy, but Paris especially got 3.2 million on their RER, and then Berlin 1.5 million on their S-Bahn, and then especially if we're looking at New York, the New York combined is 900,000, excuse me, but on 3,900 kilometers of track, and then Berlin 1.5 million on 331 kilometers, so less than 10% of the length, and then more riders. So I was just trying to put thoughts together on what do we need to make regional rail itself better in the U.S., and then I just had these 5 ideas, so I'll just put them out there to kind of kick us off, and then we can just have people pop in. So my top 5 were removing commuter from the vocabulary. So it should never be commuter rail anymore. Commuters are part of the ridership, but the ridership shouldn't be, oh, we have to focus on the commuters, we have to look at the peak hour, we can say we need 30 trains per hour capacity for the peak, but it shouldn't be a commuter system. It should be an all-day system. It should be for the region, which includes the city. And then the second one is clock-based frequencies. Regional rail is usually not going to be that every 6 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes kind of show up, unless it's in the trunk, which I'll talk about next. But it should have some kind of frequency where you know, okay, it's every 20 minutes, comes here at 56, 16, 36, some kind of frequency that you know when the train's coming. Well, and of course, it should show up at that time. But it shouldn't be a wild guess or, oh, it comes at 6 after and 45 after, and then you got a 20-minute gap and a 40-minute gap, things like that. And then the third thing is through running, which, because SEPTA has that, and then New York is still doesn't really believe in it. But a lot of these systems in Europe, well, a lot of systems have put tunnels through their center city because they saw they had a regional suburban station here, a suburban station here, and then they wanted to through run it because then you could get the trains through and the trains aren't stopping and turning in the middle of the city. So a lot of these were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Some are building now Stuttgart 21. But that's something that needs to be done if you want to get those numbers all the way up. And then fourth is integrated fare structures. So with a lot of people moving to these kind of new fare cards, things like this, you shouldn't have to think about, oh, if I take this regional rail train 2 stops instead of taking the subway 7 stops, one fare is this, the other fare is that. It should be just integrated. It should be in your monthly pass. If you're in the city zone, whatever mode you're taking, it should just be included in it should be the same fare. And finally, and sometimes controversially, is kind of staffing levels. So how many people do we need to be on a train? How many people do we need to check tickets? Do you need a conductor checking everyone's ticket on everyone's trains? Do you have roving fare teams? How many people do you need to drive the train? How many people do you need in the station? But just getting the staffing down, so adding the frequencies, so you're running every 20 minutes, every 5 minutes in the city center, every 2 minutes in the city center, so that's even possible. So that was a lot, but if anyone just wants to pop in, have their thoughts, and surprised at those numbers, anything that they've seen in other countries or in the U.S. that is being done really well, then feel free.
Let me also, I think all of your 5 points are really, really good. I would add sorry, let me turn my video on here so you, I would add a 6th one, which is equipment has to be proper. Like a lot of commuter rail in the U.S. uses, and we were just talking about this in one of the lunch panels right at the end, talking about rebuilding F40s. The F40 is a terrible locomotive to be running on commuter service. It's it's big, slow, noisy, and it pulls heavy cars. And if you want good, regional rail service, it's got to be fast acceleration. It's got to be, relatively easy to maintain and quick to operate, so that you can run frequent service, even if it's with shorter consists, to allow for the frequency. And that kind of means, for the, on the East Coast, you don't quite have as much because you do have more of the electric multiple unit trains. But, out here in Chicago, with the exception of one line, it's all, huge locomotives pulling, that are expensive to operate, pulling a handful of trailer cars. So it favors longer distance service rather than, go 2 miles and stop. Because when you are on those locals, it just takes forever because the equipment just doesn't have the acceleration performance that it could.
Let's not mix operating costs too much, because I think one of the perils of when you start getting into too short distance, you start looking at path and look at path's absolutely exorbitant operating costs. Having to do like, okay, I'm going not even a mile in some cases. Stop, brake test. Every MU is considered an engine by the FRA. So you start getting almost like, okay, at what point do we start saying we dedicate this right of way, get the freight trains off of it, and make it a real light rail type service? Because some places really need that.
I'll agree with that. That was something else I was thinking as well. And part of what I hadn't said with the equipment is getting the regulations a bit more in line with this kind of operation, instead of having the same regulation that applies to long-distance trains or a freight train that's going to be going across the country. And there's been a little bit of movement on this lately, but equipment standards based on the same standard of being able to withstand a collision with a heavy freight train at 70 miles an hour, as opposed to other technology that makes the equipment just as safe but a lot less expensive to build, which means we can go even more off the shelf with European or Asian technology that already has good mass production, as opposed to basically every order here being a custom build order.
Yeah, I think the equipment issue is really it's something key I probably should have brought up, because just when you go to these other countries and you just see these trains and it's like, oh, they have that train in Ireland, they have that train in Germany, they have the train in Italy, they have the train in Spain, and then you just think, oh, it's just a standard, but because of the FRA and various other reasons, and just kind of agencies that maybe just believe in buying what they've always bought. They don't think, oh, we could get these kind of EMUs, DMUs, we could get something they use there. And if we tried, the FRA would say, oh, no, it's got to pass all these crash tests. No way you can't use that off the shelf. So that's definitely something that is going to have to change in order to get kind of better regional rail.
I also wanted to bring up, I think there's a really interesting discussion in the chat about jobs. A lot of the discussion has been in particular about technology, how technology is going to impact rail. And so we do see in France where they have national level strikes within their transportation agency. They had a 42-day strike a few years ago, and but there were two metro lines that were the rail lines that were running nonstop during this because it was fully automated. We also see that as the case in Asia, where they've been able to fully automate certain regional or local lines, and so that also one takes out the cost from the transportation aspects of it, and also in turn makes them more efficient, more reliable, and that in turn enables more people to participate in transportation. So I think the technology is a key piece here, and automation is obviously a controversial topic, but one that definitely affects regional rail in terms of cost, but also efficiency.
So the one thing that I would just want to throw into the mix that is the one area in which I disagree with what's been said before. So first of all, just for background, I'm from Philly. I used to work for SEPTA, and then I went to work for literally, quote, the commuter rail in Boston. I'm saving those thoughts, obviously. But the biggest thing that I agree with is fare equalization for one reason. And the reason is I think off-peak absolutely equal fares 100% within the city. The problem is when you have a duplicate service that can serve an inner-city corridor and you have people taking up seats from long-distance riders, that's one of the challenges that I see of having total fare equalization. Because, for example, if I'm going to Hicksville on Long Island, I have to take the LIRR. I can't take the subway. But if I'm going to Jamaica, yes, the subway will, yes, the LIRR will get me there faster, but I have an alternative, which is to take the subway. And so the concern is when you're adding, and again, it also speaks to the equipment side of things, when you're adding to the inflexibility of not being able to dump cars at Jamaica, and all of a sudden you're now having to run much larger sets, much further distances, and having people, necessarily forced to stand, or even having to not fit onto a train and wait for the next interval because the ridership is all going to a close inner city stop. I think that's where you have a problem. And I think in my experience, where you see that the most, the sort of natural experiment done with the MBTA is that anyone going from Quincy Center Station to Boston was afforded the ability to use any sort of transit fare to take commuter rail from Quincy Center into Boston, even though the red line goes there. What we encountered is that the trains that used to be totally adequate for those lines going out to places like Greenbush, Kingston, Middleborough were becoming significantly crush-loaded, and people were being left behind at places like South Station because of the intermediate travel to Quincy Center, where it then opened up. So I think that's the thing that has to be somehow addressed in any sort of fare equalization, is how you handle the capacity concerns when there is an alternative mode that will get people to these destinations, albeit slower, but on a more reliable headway, and it doesn't wind up that you're running into these equipment concerns for such long distances.
I think something important to note about the Quincy Center example is that that period of time, the Red Line was having, the reason they did the fare equalization thing there was because the Red Line was having significant signal issues. And even if those signal issues had been, to a large part, resolved at that point, like, I bet if you asked a person who switched from the Red Line to the commuter rail, they said, oh, I'm taking the commuter rail because the Red Line is just so much slower and so much worse.
That was after the derailment, but the policy has been in place since they started doing construction on the Quincy garage. That was long before the Red Line derailment that threw everything out of whack on the Red Line. And obviously there was a massive spike immediately after the Red Line issues, but even after that, it sort of normalized back out to where it was pre-Red Line derailment, which still is significantly higher than it was prior to when they started the garage construction and implemented the policy. So I totally get that. And it is a valid point as well to discuss how you handle these sort of service disruptions, because there are cases where the LIRR will cross on or for New York City Transit and vice versa. I'm not sure if that's ever been done with Metro North on the Lex, but it is something, worth considering, is how these complementary systems can integrate both for the short term when there might be a disruption, as well as longer term.
I remember when I was first.
Sorry, someone just dropped out. I wanted to respond to that. I think we should encourage people to take the fastest service. I think it not only saves the passengers time, but it's, all other things equal, it's more cost effective for the agency to move people on faster trains because you have lower per hour operating costs. I know that there's a lot of obstacles to making that happen, but yeah, I think it would be a good idea to run the trains more often or have short turns on the commuter rail if people are riding to some of the closer in stations and then there's not room for people riding further out. Yeah, I know there's a lot of reasons why that can't happen, but I think in an ideal world, yeah, people should be taking the fastest train that goes to where they're going, and we should run enough trains so that can happen.
Disagree on that. One of the real challenges of transit systems is how do they capture the value that they create. And when you've got a commuter rail system, which is more comfortable, less crowded, faster, you should be getting more return from that for comparable service. I think one of the things that has happened in the 50 years since we have started widely subsidizing commuter rail and other transit agencies in the U.S. is that we really don't have a good sense of why we are charging fares and what those fares should be. The decision, instead of being a management decision as to what we charge the fares are, has become a political decision, and I suspect that that is increasing the deficits of our transit agencies.
Well, I think part of that is, the question of transit as a social good versus transit as, to some extent or another, a business of sorts. And if you, not saying that politicians are the best people at setting any real policy, but if you look at it in terms of how, well, you're getting the comfortable seat, therefore we're going to charge you extra money for it. The folks that are maybe only going 5 miles and they're only going to be on the train for 10 or 15 minutes, they don't necessarily care about the comfortable seat. It's just that's the service that happens to be there. So, are they paying for something that they don't necessarily want, but it's there anyway just because that's what it is. And so, then you're, in a way, you're kind of punishing people who don't have that alternative. Like I think, being from Chicago, I think of a Chicago example, there are a few a few areas where you have Metra and CTA serving either the same station or within like a couple blocks of each other. So if I'm going to the northwest side, I can get on at Jefferson Park. I could ride Metra. I don't because A, it runs every hour or so. On weekends, it's like every 2 hours. And, you know, and B, the fare is, you know, higher, so I don't. But if someone lives the next stop out, they're still in the city of Chicago. They're not next to a CTA rail station, but they have to pay a much higher fare for what amounts to a 20-minute ride. You know, they could even be standing for those 20 minutes if the train is crowded enough. They're not getting the more comfortable ride. They're standing, but they're being charged, you know, the 2 times or more the fare that they would have paid if they were on CTA riding that same distance, not because they're getting the better ride, but because that's the only ride that's offered from that particular stop.
Yeah, I want to speak a little bit to the rider experience concern too, in the last speaker's point, because I think that is a thing that we hear often, or that I hear often from commuter rail folks, is that, you know, they do expect a higher sort of quality of service, higher amenities, especially considering the fact that some of our passes clock in, our monthly passes clock in at well over, you know, $300 a month. But, you know, separating the fare issue from the service issue, from the equipment issues, I want to call out Ben's suggestion earlier, which is to Jeff's point earlier, which is talking a little bit about this, that sort of parallel services from commuter rail / regional rail and local transit. In particular, that example on our old Colony line was exacerbated by significant bottlenecks that we have on that corridor. But I think it's a very, very good example in general. I think there is definitely a challenge for a lot of our services across the U.S., which have a fairly monolithic fleet and design. You know, we do here in Boston. We do have some sort of regional express, skip-stop expresses, and short-term locals that run during normal rush hour. But I genuinely agree that maybe the solution here is also I'm formerly from Transit Matters. And we put together the regional rail report for Boston. And for the longest time, we were fairly unified in the fact that we should only just have one regional system. And I think to some degree that still holds, especially if you remove some of the bottlenecks from a lot of our regional systems in the U.S. But I mean, just sort of looking at Long Island Railroad as an example, which does have actually, no. I was going to think. I'm sort of looking for examples here in the U.S. Are there any in the U.S. that have something like in Germany, where you have a regional network that's overlaid? And I'm not thinking Amtrak, because we only have Amtrak on one line in our corridor in our network, and that's the Providence line. And some people do choose to commute from Providence via Northeast Regional, but even then, those people are also taking up capacity from other people who are coming up from like longer distance intercity travel. So I'm curious if anybody is talking about these sorts of differentiation of service and sort of more S-Bahn, regional Bahn type differentiation of equipment.
The closest parallel I can think of is probably Metro North.
Or Trenton even.
Well, I'm thinking more like Metro North, because they have 4-track main lines, and they're able to do. There's a couple like Mount Vernon West turns, and all the Greystone turns, and all the Harrisons and the New Rochelle. Granted, they're more of a zone express for the sake of crowd distribution.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also not really in the city; it's the outer stops.
Yeah.
But Metro North probably is the best example of this in the city, where you have the local Hudson Line train to Greystone, everything else is straight out.
Sure. If I can jump in SEPTA land as well in Philadelphia, there are 4 check lines also on the Peoria-Thorndike lines have been operating short terms for obviously decades. And the City Planning Commission in Philadelphia a few years ago actually put out a proposal, just a very short proposal, for a frequent service overlay on SEPTA because their lines are so differentiated between in-city lines and suburban lines. Like as much as 1/3 of the track of SEPTA track is located entirely within the city, right? And so like the city theoretically could be directly subsidizing SEPTA to just run service within those lines, and not worry about the suburbs at all, and have their street service overlay already set out for like almost half of what the needs are. So yeah.
SEPTA is actually an interesting example because you have all those lines that actually terminate in the city. So you don't have to worry about this whole crowd distribution scenario. Like, okay, if you want to run more Chestnut Hill service, great. There's no other point that these riders could get on.
Right, and I think you look at the point of fare equalization for things like that, things like, in Chicago, we were on a call not long ago talking about Metro Electric and the South Chicago branch. These lines that are entirely within cities, I think they do make the good case there for something like fare equalization. It's when you have these, and the case is limited to where you have a subway network overlaid adjacent to a regional rail network, which, the other thing that I was thinking of when we talk about the Amtrak example is the Philly market going to New York. You have a lot of people who want to take the train, but instead of taking the Amtrak for price reasons, headway reasons, flexibility reasons, wind up taking SEPTA to Trenton and then switching to New Jersey Transit to go from there. And even at Trenton, I saw firsthand going from Trenton to New York for a decent bit of time, you see a lot of rush hour commuters spending the $1,200 a month for an Amtrak monthly pass over the $600 New Jersey Transit monthly pass because their company will pay for it and they'll reimburse it. So if Amtrak's able to get that revenue, which does take up a seat from their capacity, they can sell all the way from D.C. to New York. It kind of makes sense in that regard.
Yeah, actually, the fact that companies pay for will subsidize the more convenient service if it's a business-related expense. It's actually something that a lot of, I'll say, normies don't think about when they're also complaining about, well, the Amtrak trains are always expensive. It's like, well, they can charge higher costs because, who's traveling business?
I think that SEPTA is an interesting example when we talk about different systems because if SEPTA were to kind of switch to an S-bond level service, it would obviously take, not just years but decades, and they also wouldn't be able to do it all at once. So the most likely example would be that they'd have, some lines would kind of move to a lower labor cost, higher frequency, maybe even lower fare service model years and decades before other lines. So there definitely would be a transition period where different lines would be run quite differently. And I think that that's something that just kind of culturally I think SEPTA would find very difficult to accept, but really it's the only way it could possibly be done. So, would you have a situation where, the Chestnut Hill lines and the airport lines add those high-level platforms, add those ticket vending machines, and switch to a different operating model while still maintaining the current system for the other lines while their upgrades are happening? Could they really manage, or maybe more importantly, would they be willing to manage those kind of two different models within the same system? And if they're not willing to do that, then I don't think any reform is possible.
I think the fare structure has a significant impact on whether you want to equalize or not. If you go to a rapid transit system like London's, where everything is entrance and exit, and you get significant variation on the fares depending on how far you go, you've got a different issue on fare equalization than if you're trying to equalize with, say, New York City, where for the one base fare you get a very long ride. So I think you have to include in your discussion of fare equalization what your structure of your transit fare is.
It's worth noting that for something like that, where you have even more zones being added on, the larger the complexity of your fare structure, the more cumbersome it is to administer, unless you have tap-in, tap-out gates. Right? Because if all of a sudden passengers who just, okay, I'm going to Jamaica, 1, 2, 3, done. If I start distinguishing every single stop, every other passenger is going to need a step up. Right? That costs money to administer. That costs money to collect. I think there's some level of zoning that we can do, but I guess
I mean, Sonny, that's assuming that you're collecting on board every single rider as opposed to doing any sort of gated system, proof of purchase-based system, downtown gates, external validators, something like that. And, like, don't get me wrong, now that I'm no longer at SEPTA, I can say this. I don't like the way the regional rail key implementation is going. I think there should be not just validators at outlying stations, but TVMs at many outlying stations. Are there not
validators at every outlying station?
There are validators at every outlying station, but not TVMs, which means if you show up and you want to pay cash or don't have a key card already, your options are, A, go to a grocery store to purchase a key card, or get on board the train, pay cash, or I believe soon to be credit, on board the train to the conductor who will hand you a receipt to get through the gates in the downtown stations. Like, there are ways around a system, that's not necessarily just the limiting factor of if you're selling a different ticket for each zone.
And I like to say that SEPTA Key is another example of where they're really not thinking about how capital improvements can really save on future operating improvements, right? Because you have validators at every station, and yet you also have onboard conductors with now new smartphones that can handle onboard sales that are also validators, right? It's totally redundant, and yet you're missing on the TVMs that actually replace for the conductor's entire position of sales, right? And so once you don't have that you have to keep conductors for indefinitely until SEPTA has another new expensive contract to justify TVMs. It's really just backwards.
Yeah, this is Jaime. In Boston, we're looking at validators every 1 to 200 feet on the platforms, vending machines at every station, and also still fare validation, spot checking on board. Although really the goal is to take this highly work-intensive task away from conductors and let them spend more of their time dealing with safety and management of passengers, and less on collecting fares, right? Because so the new system in Boston will be you tap in at the station, whether that's a terminal or an outlying station, and you tap out when you at the station where you get off, and that determines your fare. So, and if you fail to tap off, then you get charged the most expensive zone.
Jamie, can I ask if MHA is Jamie, can I ask if MHA is going to reconsider the level of conductor staffing they're mandated to provide, or that kind of rule at all after fare reform?
So our level of staffing is set by union agreement. Right now it is 1 conductor per 300 riders on any given train.
Yeah.
That is totally negotiable. And one of the reasons that it is that low is because conductors have literally 40 things to do on any given trip, and interacting with the customers eats up a significant portion of their time. So if they didn't need to collect fares, and they don't, I talk to a million conductors, all the time. They don't necessarily, they have no vested interest in collecting fares. If they didn't have to, they'd be fine with a different ratio, but it would have to be negotiated in their contract.
So
I think the only thing that I'd add to that is there are also a lot of those trains that are overstaffed, which is where on the commuter rail operator side, there are all of those contractual obligations for how many crew members are on board the train. And there are a lot of cases where, due to other demands like safety needs, like we're talking about, and this gets into the vehicle procurement whole side of the spectrum of the fact that you have so many low-level platform stations with equipment that requires you to manually open a door and manually drop a trap open, let passengers off, manually close the trap, and manually close the door at each station. There are a lot of trains that, for dwell reasons and on-time performance, they have more assistant conductors on them than would otherwise be required. So I think, if anything, the biggest impact to staffing costs would be having, the ability to train line a door panel with high level and low level, like you can do on regional rail, on the Silverliner 5s, on every class of service New Jersey Transit train that is more recent than the Comet 3s, and is not an issue on Metro North electric territory or LIRR because they're just all high level.
Oh, so I've been wanting to ask this because I've never wanted to bother you at work, but also we have a wider audience. So my fascination with this equipment thing and train lining doors for low-level platforms is, how do they handle traps on the Silverliner 5s?
Can answer that right now. Okay, literally is the same manual trapdoor that's been implemented for decades since the Silverliner 2, right? 1960s technology has not evolved since, and that is a big, I constantly gripe on that on Twitter. And basically, high platforms notwithstanding, right? Why couldn't there be a solution just automate that trapdoor, and that would instantaneously save,
Well, look at what NJC is doing on the MLV.
So let me wait. Well, hold on. So that is something. Yeah, I think what Mark's talking about are the Silverliner 5s. So in terms of the trap on the Silverliner 5, the trap mechanism itself is still a manual trap that they have to raise and lower. However, the door, instead of the door, so if the door is this high and the trap's here, the door extends from the top of the door panel all the way to the bottom of the trap, and there's a little rubberized slit that's on the outside of the train. So if you press the open high train level button, what it does is each door has a sensor to determine if the trap is down. What it does is, if the trap is down, it opens the door, which is a full-length door, but leaves the rubberized gap filler in. If you press open low, it checks for all the doors where the trap is open, and then opens not just the door, but also the little gap filler so that passengers can get on and off of the train. And that's the way it is on SEPTA's newer equipment and New Jersey Transit equipment. Obviously, there are solutions like in the Bay Area where the steps literally can go up and down automatically, but that's a separate, there's really two things there. Just getting the first to have, like New Jersey Transit standard practice on the Morris and Essex lines is that each double, as it would be called in commuter rail territory, of the ends of the cars where you have one door in each car, is you leave one trap open and the trap down on the other, and that allows you to press open high, open low remotely, and then at each set of doors, at least one door will open for every low-level platform, one for every high level.
Okay, because that was actually literally the thing that I wanted to go to Transportation Camp Philly to Railfan, was to actually get video of how these doors work, but oh well.
I think the whole equipment discussion really highlights the importance of having a long-term vision, kind of like the MBTA has, because for two related reasons. One, a lot of the improvements are only going to make things very slightly better by themselves, as in you really only get the big change when there's a couple things happen at once. So for SEPTA, for example, if you were to fix all the high-level platforms, but then you weren't able to buy tickets at stations, you'd still need to keep the conductors to sell tickets. Or if you were to get, on the flip side, if you were able to get ticket vending machines at every station, but you still had doors where people weren't able to get on by themselves if they had ADA issues, you still need to have conductors. So there are all these kind of now each one of those things by themselves would improve service, but you don't really get that whole jump forward of being able to change the whole operating model unless those things happen together. And then so it kind of becomes this excuse, well, we're not going to do this because we don't really get that much benefit from it. When you discuss all these marginal benefits, and then in the meantime, what ends up happening is you make decisions like deciding to get bi-level trains or whatever that then kind of lock out the other vision for 40 years. So, you're like, well, I'm not going to better to make this marginal improvement because we don't really get the big gain because it's only one of 3 or 4 steps that need to happen. And then that just kind of continually perpetuates the same level of service, and then you make these equipment decisions that might lock you into one vision for 50 years. So if you're not saying, okay, not only are we going to think about what regional rail looks like in the next 5 years, but what it looks like the next 20 to 50, you're just kind of accidentally going to perpetuate the broken system we have now.
Yeah. I had a question
for
Malik?
Malik.
Malik? Yeah. Amongst your five points, the one that really intrigues me the most is the one that let's get over calling this using the word commuter. And BART admittedly is kind of a unique system. It was sort of the first of the modern rail transit systems back in 1970. We haven't really changed a whole lot from 1972, but it was designed for commuters. And we're still laboring with getting over the notion that we serve guys in suits with briefcases getting on in a bedroom suburb riding to Montgomery Street in San Francisco. And it's not just a service issue. It's more of a perception issue and an equity issue. I'm wondering, who do you think is addressing that really well about broadening their market base from commuter to everybody in the United States, that is?
So I'll start off. So we have 3 minutes left in this panel. Thank everybody for coming. And also, I'm from the Bay Area, from Walnut Creek, so I'm very familiar with BART. But who's doing? I mean, I think it starts with the naming. Like, is it regional transit? Is it rapid transit? Or is it commuter rail? Is it just rail? And then how your government is doing the seats on the board? Is it where are you physically your stations? So there's a lot, but who's doing it well right now? I mean, Philly has the whole setup going. They're one of the best. BART is kind of the hybrid. I think BART does it pretty well. We were talking about is someone going to get on and take a seat from something that's a 30-minute, 60-minute ride? BART has enough standing room, and especially the new trains have the standing room. So if you're going Embarcadero to West Oakland, which is a 5-minute ride, you don't care about having a seat for that 5-minute ride. You'll go stand in the middle. There's enough time you can get on and off the train. And if you're going to Antioch, you're going 30-minute ride. You might try to get the seat. You might get the seat. You have to wait 10, 15 minutes. But eventually, if you need the seat, or if you have to ask for one, you can get the seat. And kind of back to the equipment, thinking about how are we designing this equipment? Are we designing equipment to maximize the number of seats? Are we designing equipment to maximize the number of riders in a peak hour? So we might take out some seats, put some handballers, put some places where people can stand. Everything, everyone's talking about all these legacy things. Everything has to go together, but we have to start somewhere, basically. So it might be starting with the seats, might be starting with your staffing if you somehow have some leverage on kind of staffing issues. It might be starting with, we're just going to do 20-minute headways and we're just going to pay for that right now and show what the service is. It might be starting with the fares, but I think every place has something they can start with, and then everything's intertwined, but you start somewhere, and then you just keep it moving, and then eventually, I don't think we're going to get like 4 million a day like Paris, 3.2 million, but we can definitely get these numbers to a place where it's kind of all these systems are respectable regional rail systems. So if anyone has any last final remarks.
Related to that, a key point about BART and also WMATA and MARTA is they cover an area comparable to a regional rail system, but they operate like a subway. They're built like a subway. They have fare gates at every station. They have high-level platforms, so they don't have the same equipment and personnel challenges that we were just talking about that the legacy systems have. Caltrain is a more comparable example to the legacy regional rail in California than BART is in terms of how it operates. So even though BART covers an area comparable to regional rail, it operates like a subway, and that opens up a lot of possibilities that the legacy commuter rail doesn't, a legacy regional rail doesn't have.
Yeah, I think the issue is just the legacy itself, that these commuter rail systems came from the old railroads of like the 1800s. And in some cases, they still operate that way.
Yeah.
And so, and the thing is, you know, they were built to compete with each other, not to integrate with each other. And that's why we have a lot of the issues that we have, because we've never fixed that one big thing, is that, you know, big commuter railroads and the older subway systems in like, or elevator rail systems in Chicago and Boston and New York, they were all competitors in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and even if agencies took them over, they never really organized in a way that got rid of that, hey, we're competing with each other aspect. Whereas you go to Europe and other places and they say, okay, this is one agency, or it may be operated by different people, but we're going to treat it all as if it's the same.
I think that and the primacy of freight as a revenue source for the railroads also is kind of a retarding effect still on commuter rail.
Yeah, it definitely depends on the network. I mean, we dispatch most of the territory in Boston, except for the parts of the network that are actually owned by, that are dispatched and owned by the freight. No, I think we own them, but the dispatching is still done by the freight operators because they have significant traffic on those networks. But agreed. I mean, Keolis also operates VRE in Virginia, and you know, but the state is making investments to upgrade commuter rail reliability down there.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we're about out of time. And then the next panel here is COVID-19 and transportation equity in low-income neighborhoods. So thanks for the conversation.
Thank you, Malik.
Thank you, Malik.
Thank you, Malik.